I'm really excited to announce the next two speakers. They're a couple of speakers whose work I've been familiar with for the last couple of years. I regularly go to Sundance. I go about once every 2 years to check out all the cool stuff that's happening in Sundance Frontiers. And these next couple of speakers, I've seen their work there and I was blown away by it. So it's very exciting to bring them up on stage for them to share their story with you. They're pretty much the rock stars of VR. Between them, they've made innovative and thought-provoking VR works that have influenced global decision makers, changed government policies. Clouds Over Sidra, which is what I saw at Sundance a couple of years ago, was incredible, as well as My Mother's Wing, Waves of Grace, and Congo. You can watch them all. They're all on the device, all on the VR app, which you can download and you've got on your phones already, or you can go check it out over there later. So please welcome Creative Director and Senior Advisor to the United Nations, Gabo Arora, and Co-founder and CEO of Variable Labs, and Chief Digital Strategist for the UN, Barry Pousman. Big round of applause, guys. Welcome.
Thank you. So, is it working, the microphones, right? Everyone can hear us?
Can you guys hear us?
Great. So, hello, Australia.
Hello.
It's our first time. We're very excited to be here. Beautiful, beautiful city and beautiful event. So thank you for having us. So I just want to start a little bit about what we do. I'm Gabo. This is Barry. And we work together at something called UNVR, which is the United Nations Virtual Reality Lab, that we started after we did our first film, Clouds Over Sidra, which you can watch here. And then we have Waves of Grace and My Mother's Wing, which is a story based in Gaza. So if you haven't seen it, we encourage you because it's a little bit, we're going to do our best to, talk about VR, but as people know, it's really how you experience VR that's really the truth of how you really feel about it. So we're going to try to make some sort of outline here, The
hills are alive.
So, I don't know, is this
supposed to be blinking?
It's fine.
Okay.
We'll have three parts here. History of representing the pain of others, quite ambitious. United Nations virtual reality, I think I've heard of that. And then we're going to go totally Jim Morrison on all of you. Since the beginning of visual media, we've always felt this need to kind of represent what we went through, and we come back and we say, this is what happened. I was, hunting, or there's something with storytelling and visual stuff that starts with the cave area. A lot of it is related to representing the pain of others. And so, you have the cave paintings, and then this is a painting from the Napoleonic Wars. And this was really like peak sort of war painting time, where for the first time people started showing emotion and suffering of the enemy in some sense. And there was this kind of sort of sense that if we were able to show things and paint things, maybe our sort of relationship with violence and war will change. This is one of the first photographs from the American Civil War, which is, if you look down into the field beyond, that's actually a battlefield. And these are actually either politicians or civilians who are trying to get as close as possible as they can to the action. We have this inner need to try to understand what's happening. And there is this sort of idea that in some ways our understanding it better would help us make better decisions or help prevent war to begin with. That's kind of the thinking in the beginning. But, some people who watch certain things will respond differently depending on what side you're on. So it's not just inherent to the idea that you're just being exposed to something horrific is going to necessarily prevent you from doing it. Because the same thing that motivated you to help refugees was used by ISIS to show you what would happen to you in case you left. So there is a kind of a fallacy that we're trying to challenge, that it really is just about being there. There has to be something a little bit more deeper and complex. After World War I, there was a book by Ernest Friedreich called War Against War. It had 30 of the most gruesome pictures, many of them that are not here, that were meant as to show that this was something that shouldn't happen again. And in 1930, the book was a bestseller in Germany and was in many editions all over the world. It didn't stop what came next, right? But maybe this did in the Depression. Not sensational, a little bit deeper, and has a different approach that we try to take. So, by many accounts, World War I and Depression and World War II, really the first sort of photographed wars where we tried to kind of understand our relationship with violence. And then we moved to the first televised war, arguably. It's not Korea, it's Vietnam. And again, we see a new medium that's trying to challenge and try to make it even more immersive, or somehow if we see this, this is somehow going to change our behavior. And then sometimes it does, but it has its own limitations because I watched Gulf War I televised and it was very different and it had a very different emotional impact. So I think it's important to think, you know, our numbness to new media and what's happening and where VR comes with that. So this sort of thing is related to a sensational approach that we don't want to take. Now, in the UN and in international development, there was this same sort of, almost I'd say, warlike mentality of how we should show suffering at a certain point.
Here, 10 million third world children don't live to see their third birthday.
So some of you might be used to what's happening with this. This is Sally Struthers.
Happy birthday.
And in the 80s, with the famine in Ethiopia and everything, again, if only we can show you, somehow this motivates you. And it does motivate you to a certain point. But after a while, it becomes less and less effective. And so this is something, I'm showing it, one, because it's actually really funny, if you look at it now, because you would think that's acceptable. But two, it's to show you what we're not trying to do, and what's very seductive to do in a new medium, in some ways. Now, if Vietnam was the first sort of televised war, and then it led to how it influenced things, we have now YouTube, the first YouTube war, arguably, which could be in Syria, where you have citizens themselves who have the most authenticity of what's happening in a certain area. Again, with the same sort of idea that this is what is needed. But again, it doesn't always motivate to a certain extent, because you can watch through that YouTube footage. It's horrific. It's absolutely insane. If I kept playing that over there, you would feel absolutely traumatized. Yet it doesn't change things. It's not changing things. But our sort of hypothesis is that there's a certain way of telling stories that changes things. But it's also this idea of passivity that still comes with even TV, or it comes with even YouTube, or it comes with photographs, that VR, I think, challenges. And Susan Sontag, who wrote Regarding the Pain of Others, talks through a lot of how, what some of the criteria are and how things work. And we think VR, and particularly what we're trying to do, is trying to always stay within that philosophical framework. So I'm going to hand it off to Barry really quickly for this part. But this has become a very hot button issue of it's the empathy machine in VR. Now, Brothers Karamazov was an empathy machine for me, as was Jackson Pollock, as was a lot of other things that can inspire you to do it. Our sort of thing is that we are indeed almost, or are working with, how this particular medium can have that same empathetic effect. Now, if I'm going to make an empathetic, or my goal is to make you have empathy in a movie, I'm going to construct it with very different of how I write a book, or how I make an art installation. And I think how we do it in VR also is different. And I think there's some things we can learn from, but some things are new, uncharted territory. So when we say empathy, it's about how you define it, and it's within that context. So I'm going to leave it to Barry to take us through this.
Great. Thanks, Gabo. This, for me, hi guys, I'm Barry, by the way. And I got into VR through an opportunity with the UN where they showed me a camera. We worked with the Verse on this, and they handed me the camera, and they showed me a one take, just you get to spend time on someone's couch, you see their dog in the background, and they get their dog and they kind of bring it up to the camera, and the dog licks the camera, and you are that camera, you quickly learn. And so that was pretty much the training that we had going in to make Clouds Over Cedra and to shoot Clouds Over Cedra, and we sort of had to take a dogmatic approach of how we're going to film this. It was so long ago that there hadn't been documentaries in VR at that point. And so we didn't know, was this going to be a long one take, and we picked the best one? Was this going to be something sort of hyper stylized and dramatic, looking down on the camp from the water tower or a guard tower? We chose to take the route of, sort of putting yourself at the same eye line, putting yourself in the shoes of others, putting yourself literally next to the people you want to talk about and sort of share their experience. So we wanted to bring the audience down to the level of this child back then, and so I'll just go on. So we knew that you can do a lot of change, we can make a lot of impact with a small amount of content. We've done some past stuff, and there's a really bottom-up approach, right? Sally Struthers, $10 here, $1 there. That's a bottom-up approach. Over time, you get a lot of money, and it goes up. You could also show VR at the UN, where you can show it to world leaders, we can show it to people in the Security Council, we can bring it to donor conferences where billionaires attend with the purpose of donating money to a cause. So we have a real opportunity to shift the thinking, to shift the needle from a top-down approach. And that's unique in some ways to the UN. So, we did we really were able to break through the noise of what the UN usually does. Rarely does the UN get great headlines. No, I mean, the UN's great, sorry. But we got to do some great things. I think Gabo's favorite quote is on the bottom.
It's a real quote. It was in the New Yorker magazine, the print edition. I swear to God, you go there, that's exactly what it says. But, we made it to the New Yorker.
Yeah.
It was pretty awesome.
It broke through the noise.
Yeah.
And so, we got together and decided with a few others how we can kind of encapsulate this, how we can tie this off and think about this as a forward-moving object. We want to continue to, attend to deal with the gravest humanitarian crises of our time. And we want to do it in a forward-thinking way. We want to get away from the Sally Struthers. We want to get away from the sensationalism. And we want to lean into the most empathetic experiences we can find today. And we found that this is...
Can I interrupt you?
Please. Get on there.
His fear was that I was going to interrupt him in that way, so I just had to do it.
Lay it on me.
But it's also, I think, the belief of empathy leading to action, right? Because I think a lot of things can do that, but we're always making sure that we measure what that action is, and and that's what I think is a little bit more fascinating. It's not just empathy for empathy's sake. It's empathy that's directed to something where we know things can change for a lot of these people. In whatever way we try to measure it, we try to at least hold ourselves to some sort of standard.
Mm-hmm. So we can keep talking over this, but this is exactly to that point about actually measuring impact through these small, short pieces of content. So UNICEF, they loved Clouds Over Cedra. They decided we're going to want to cut this film down to 4 minutes. We want to translate it into 6 languages. We want to distribute this film with Google Cardboard around the world, 40 countries across those 6 languages. And they gave it to street teams, and this is out of New Zealand, and they found that instead of 1 out of every 12 people giving money to the street person, right, with a clipboard and a blue hat, 1 out of every 6 people gave donations. Now that is a huge game changer in UNICEF's fundraising for the year. I mean, that's like the biggest piece of their fundraising pie comes from the blue hats and the clipboards. So this really did, move the needle in 4 minutes and a few different languages. I'll just move on. Okay, so anyway, the whole point is we have found a way to kind of speak a new language, to raise money, raise awareness, move the needle. And over time, let's see what's next, we've found that we can challenge the way the UN has been thinking about solving these problems. This is the old UN. This is what we're up against, George Clooney. These days, if you asked who would recognize George Clooney, it'd be a lot less than, maybe 10 years ago. Now we recognize Casey Neistat. We recognize YouTubers. We recognize Snapchatters. So my background is I think a lot about viral videos, think a lot about how media shares and spreads online, and look at the UN, the world's largest NGO with 87,000 subscribers. I'm sure many people in this room have more subscribers on their YouTube channels. So that's a sad day, right? We're not very good at telling stories at the UN. Here's 3 days ago, 71 views, 165 views, 57 views. That's a sad number, right? We put all this time, someone went out and filmed it, someone edited it, someone put it on the internet, it got 57 views. We're doing something very wrong. So that's the approach that the UN traditionally takes. This is how they use new media. They sort of put the radio show on the television, and they suffer the low view counts. Angelina Jolie comes to the table. Okay,
a little better.
Get a small bump. Get the Angelina Jolie bump. 87,000 views. And then, this is what's out there. This is the BuzzFeeds of our time. We have to compete with 6 million views and decaying hamburgers. It turns out McDonald's is the worst in this scenario. Whoops. Okay, so what we had an opportunity to do maybe 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, was go to Ecuador to the Amazon. And we,
Before VR.
Before, this is pre-VR. This is flatties, the rectangles, whatever we want to call it. So we went out with the intention of how we're going to change that conversation, how we're going to change making media for good, for impact. And we met a girl in the village, in a village deep in the jungle. It was crazy. And, it was really her aunt who was like a community leader and a big rebel rouser and really was fighting for the people and the rights and, fighting against oil and all these things. And we found that the stump speech just wasn't going to be effective. No one's sharing a stump speech from a villager that's speaking Spanish a million miles a minute and has a thing that they've got a script and they know what to say. And that's sort of the old way, And so we found this girl and we had her tell the stories that her grandparents have told her about the changing weather patterns, that her friends, had come to school with oil stained on their hands. And she spoke right to the camera. And it's a very eye contact-driven piece. And we sort of were taking cues from what works on YouTube. Reverse engineered, like, wow, everyone seems to be doing very well when they talk right to that camera on YouTube. Let's play with our YouTube opportunity here. And it got 1.5 million views, and the government of Ecuador apologized to that community, and so it really did move the needle. And we went on to work with Humans of New York. I don't know if you guys know Humans of New York, but this was a really cool opportunity where we could leverage someone's massive reach, massive engagement opportunity for good, right? For raising
also
awareness.
Learn from his storytelling,
For sure.
Which really influences the UNVR because it's not about we're the UN and this is what we did and this is how awesome we are. It's about people and the complexities of their stories. That it's not awful and it's not totally awesome. It's somewhere in between. It's so interesting. So I think that's where that was right before VR. So that's where our thinking was.
Gabo likes Humans of New York down there. Dionysus.
Yes, Dionysus. What's the time check before we get into the Jim Morrison part of this? Okay, that's good. I'm doing pretty good here. We're doing good. I interrupted you once, maybe twice. Not too bad.
Par for course.
Yeah. What?
Par for course.
Yes, exactly, I think. So that's to set up a little bit of our background of what it was. Now we want to go into a little bit more of a how-to about, I heard you're practical down under, right? So you want to do some practical stuff. So Dionysus, why are we starting with Dionysus? We have a new medium here. We need a whole new language of how we can even think about what we experience. And why is that important? I can't think of any greater example than wine. Because when I By the way, my son's middle name is Dionysus. He was conceived in a vineyard in Burgundy. And it was really at the Mecca of wine where I was trying to understand wine. And the first thing that I was taught was, yes, to experience it, but the vocabulary that comes to talk about it. And I think once we understand how we talk about VR in that way, I think we'll understand what it's actually doing to us. Because I think until I learned the words tannic or flamboyant or oaked or laser-like, I've never used laser-like, I haven't been able to think of wine differently. It opens up what you're experiencing. So I think with VR, it's a similar thing, where there's a word and how we define them and what we think. The one that really comes up a lot, and this is some more, look at this, jammy, hot, astringent, muscular, chewy. I mean, this is incredible. Look at what they've done over here. And I think this changes your relationship to what you're experiencing. So in VR, a lot of it is presence. If I can think of one vocabulary word that we're really trying to understand, even though it's something we don't feel or we felt, is this sense of embodiment that happens, where you actually feel you're somewhere. And I would argue, and there's a lot of arguments in VR, which is very healthy, and I don't know where you are, is we really need to debate those things and think about it. And for me, the same way if you have, as we call them, flatties, flatties are the derogative term to the people who control the world right now with that 2D limited thing, I think you guys do it. I think that, to me, there's a thread to keep someone and make compelling content. And I think usually that thread is the story. And story is very important in VR as well. But we have this other layer about presence. Because when we're editing and we're thinking and we're doing it, I'm sometimes more mystically moved by a certain scene that I know just makes you want to be there. And I need to think about where that goes with the story. And it's a very different feeling. Now, the only thing I can think of is when we think of presence, we often think about when we first experience somewhat of the presence when people break the fourth wall in cinema. And when that happens, it's that moment where you feel something. And that happens in VR as well. But the point we're going to make is that as radically, as incredible as it was when the fourth wall was first broken for cinema, there are similar moments to be discovered in VR that will give you that feeling. And it's not just looking you in the eyes, as we will show you. But before we do, this is one of the most exquisite scenes in the history of cinema. And it's considered one of the first times, really, that an actor broke out and broke the wall. Smokes a cigarette. There's love right there. Go back, connected, but now you're alone. You're alone again. Boom. Close up. Incredible. And that's what we got to do with what we're trying to do here. And this is the same feeling you'll get, but with a very unique way. You see the girl coming at you? Barry, you want to maybe give a little commentary of what you think?
Sure, yeah. So, a lot of what we work with is symmetry in this spherical bubble we're living in. And, there's opportunities for spontaneity. There's opportunities for people to kind of turn towards you and reach out, look at you. This is a moment in the film where you're in a computer lab in a refugee camp, and that's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. Just that sentence.
They're playing this sort of violent game,
And then all of a sudden you become part of the scene, and they talk to you, and you get to really get inside there. And albeit, really is in air quotes, as we get closer and closer to new technologies, maybe really will get better and better. But as far as a movie goes, I think this is as really as we're getting today. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Actually, when you watch it in the set, it really... So, the other things that we play with are when you feel that you're being acknowledged and when you don't feel you're being acknowledged. So what happens is some scenes you feel very comfortable thinking that you're a fly on the wall, and there's others where you're surprised, and there's others where you go back. That also in pacing and rhythm and presence is, I don't want to say a formula, but I do think there's something we think about a lot. When is it that someone feels that? Now, like this one, there's a surprise to it, and then I think it becomes more surprising when they touch each other. And the one right after this is the other things that we say with presence that is very important is the eye level. And so a lot of things at eye level when you're able to have someone talk to you, I think is very intense, but it's also the distance. And so in a lot of ways when we talk about storyboarding, people think about storyboarding as, okay, now we're doing it for a sphere, but the distances within that too really change how you are going to react to something. And it's a lot harder because it's blind. Now this was quote unquote a mistake almost because we kept the camera too high and not at the eye level. But in some ways that made you feel like you were an adult and you were looking down on children. So in some ways it worked, even it doesn't. And this is one where, do you want to say something about this? Where I think it's at eye level. This one is interesting.
Yeah. So this is DeConti from Waves of Grace, and you'll notice she kind of never really makes eye contact with you as the audience, but you really want her to. You want to look at her eyes. You want to see how she's feeling, and she just keeps it away from you. And so there's something to be taken away, even if they're not making eye contact. That
because you yearn for it, and it also keeps you in that thing, and also having an ocean on your other side. In some ways, with the binaural sound, you're hearing the ocean and you're compelled, but you want to see her. And again, that keeps you and that gives you a sense of presence. And this is in My Mother's Wing in Gaza, our first sort of motion sort of piece. People think you can't do motion, but actually if you do it at a consistent sort of speed and you stabilize it in the car.
Yeah, one thing they say in VR that works well in the Vive and the gaming side is if you have a nose, if your character has a nose, you tend to get less nauseous when you're moving around directions because there's something fixed. And so the walls, the edges of the car are fixed, even though everything around you is moving. And so that really helps people stay non-nauseous.
Yeah. So we want to now finish with people like to think about what's it like to be on a shoot. And usually it's myself and someone who's a lot more experienced at a camera. And it's usually a team of two that I go with. I went with Barry to Gaza and with Clouds Over Sidra. And so this is something about what's it like. It's a 2-minute, very quick thing about what's it like to be on the ground, what's it like to work with some of the communities, and then we can open up a quick Q&A. And so we'll just play this for you.
Where you are.
Cool. Everyone, please thank
Thank you.
Gabo and Barry.
Yeah, just on a practical level, I take it you don't have any kind of video split feed from the camera that you're using, yeah?
No.
So how do you get around knowing what you've got? Like, especially if you're setting it up in a place where it's a different culture, different language, etc. People are shy about what you're doing. How do you do a setup, shoot it, and then view it back to see what you've got? Or do you just keep moving?
I mean, we have a very good relationship with people because all of our films are done with the local UN offices, and all of the people who choose to be in our films have some relationship with the local offices. So that gives us a little bit more of a leeway and a little more patience on their side and a little bit more understanding, because I think they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, and so are we. And so that's what it is. I think what we do is we shoot a lot of things, and then we look at it at night on our laptop, and you can only see different cameras, but you can kind of get a sense of what's happening. But I think the first time was the most nerve-wracking because we really didn't know what it would look like. But after a while of like seeing final products, I can get a good sense of how to do it blind in some sense, in that way. And in some ways, I've always been a nostalgist, like analog type of like hipster shit, you know? And so I was really, I kind of like to keep that kind of purity because I just think it leads to more spontaneity, crazy things. You learn a little bit more from your mistakes even. Because I think if I was really, and actually I've used one of those things once in Waves of Grace, and it was, for lighting, and it looked great, but actually what happens is it changes when you record it. Like little things I didn't know, that once you record a GoPro and you have something switched on, it actually is not reading you the right light meter or something like that. And I was just like, that was a waste of time, So I don't think that's how we deal with it. Any way that you?
No, I think that's spot on. We often, we find that we kind of have to craft the scene beforehand. So, if you're asking someone to go do something that's pretty intense, maybe like visit their own child's gravestone or something, very intense moments. The first time they go there and the camera's rolling, there's a different sense than the second time they go or the third time they go. And so, they kind of emote differently, and we want to capture all those different layers and levels. And so, in some ways, there's an overcoverage solution to that problem.
Well,
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to kiss each other, boys.
Yeah. We let them know. That was totally cool.
I think sometimes it's more directed, and sometimes it's more to see what would happen if they forgot about the camera being there. And so I think it's a little bit of a mix, because sometimes we want things for sure where so it's very long take sometimes, with the sort of idea of like in post or in the edit, that's where you're looking for it. And you have them sometimes do things multiply, even though it's like, all right, make yourself another cup of coffee. Let's do it again.
Just even those two scenes you showed there of the boys' computer room and then going to school, lining up the school children, they're two very normal things that would happen in any kind of society around the world. And then, but to have that layer on top of it being in a refugee camp is extraordinary. It really does take you there. Incredible. Any other questions for Barry and Gabo? Yep, right up there. We'll go over there first, and then we'll come over here. This is good. We should have had like a boom mic like they do in Q&A,
Hi, thanks very much for that. I was just interested in you talking about earlier about how people are becoming desensitized to images, something I guess we're all used to, and it's a great example about how you were able to double the people responding to your campaigns. Just looking forward 20 or 30 years, is it possible that we will again become desensitized, and how do you view?
That's that's a very valid question, but we haven't become desensitized to Brothers Karamazov. 150 years later, I think there's something. Charlie Chaplin. It's silent. It'll always work. I think it'll always have some sort of thing there. So I think what it is we try to really go into the realm of art and, you know, really understand that in art there's a little bit more of a complex thing, that we make it more idiosyncratic and more authentic to what it would be. So these are definitely like poetic documentaries, you know. They won't fit, like they're a new language of documentary that hasn't existed before in the same way. It uses a lot of those things, but it's like, to me, I kind of see it more as that's some of the ethics of it too, I think, because if you use poetry or you use that kind of way to communicate ideas, I think people sometimes feel uncomfortable with that, especially if you're journalistic or there's other things. Because there's definitely scenes in each one of the movies has a scene that's like for Werner Herzog, you know, like we don't care about anybody else, you know,
Audience of one.
We have an audience of one, and I think people would feel horrified. So I think that's what's going to really be whether we'll be desensitized or not. So I think it will be less desensitized.
I'm sure in 20 years' time, the Oculus Rift will jam straight into your nervous system, and you can actually feel someone lick your face. It'll actually be great. Down here, we had another question over here. Yep. Introduce yourself as well.
Hi, Jonathan. I've seen all your films and they're fantastic. Thank you, first of all, for that. When you're making documentaries, you can't rehearse the scene, but you can't really be there to sort of see what you've got and directing it. How do you manage that side of not having a video split and making a film with a documentary that you can't rehearse?
I mean,
We go with the flow.
Yeah.
You know, in a lot of ways, we like feel the vibe. We know what we kind of have some back pocket moments that we need to fill in the gaps, and in some ways we spin the dice. In other ways, you know, often we'll come back and, oh man, that shot did not quite land like we were hoping it would. So we'll make sure to shoot that again, you know, in a different way, at a different time of day or a different spot or wherever it is.
But I think we also, like other people mentioned, we hide. We try to, you know, look for things, and we try.
Look through the cracks sometimes.
So besides documentaries, I also was second unit director on the U2 VR video called Song for Someone that Chris Milk did. And when we had to interview Larry, we made sure that we could see through the keyhole when we closed the door. And I mean, that's a little bit weird, but it just shows you how early it is and how creative you have to be. So, but I think that's all going to change, and all, you know, life is going to be less interesting, maybe. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, it'll be in a green screen, and we'll be, you know, sending Anderson Cooper out to photogeographic, you know, captures.
Do you have cans on, or is everybody mic'd up? And
it depends on the scene, so depends on what's happening and what it is. So that's how we
it might have been a bit difficult in those refugee camps to sort of work like that.
Yeah, it's definitely
all very difficult.
It's definitely complicated. We get muddy.
Yeah.
One way we battle a lot of the sort of technical limitations is we get scrappy. So neither of us come from a big film sort of, you know, craft food services and trailers and all that world. So, you know, that can get in the way in a lot of ways in VR, because capturing the whole space. And when you're out in the field, that craft services truck is going to be in the shot, you know. Yeah. So we don't come from that background, and that really is helpful. All of a sudden, you know, a few Zoom H4Ns placed strategically can create binaural audio like, you know, you've never imagined, and that's a few $100.
Are you trying to say in the middle of the Congo there's no trailer?
Yeah.
I am not coming to work
it
with you
was,
guys.
It was a shanda.
We've got a question down here. Maybe this will be the last one before we head on to the next panel.
Hi, Nick Hunter. I was just wondering, so it sounds like, is there a lot ending up on the cutting room floor? Like, how much in the post-production phase are you stitching? Like, do you do a light stitch and then watch it back and go, oh, that scene doesn't work, let's look at take 3 or something like that?
We light stitch, and we see all of the footage that we could see in the headset. And yeah, I mean, then of course, our average shooting for each film is about 1 terabyte, I think.
Just over.
So then we take from that, and we work with, and also, you know, we do it with VerseWorks and Verse, and they're, you know, I can't imagine a more incredible, creative, and, you know, like I am able to, you know, we're able to access editors that are if they haven't been nominated for an Oscar, I won't take them. It's like, like you can have like the talent that really comes from a lot of Los Angeles. So you really we have a lot of people who help us kind of think about things. I always try to come up with some inspiration, or we try to think about something, and then I think really it's that post-production. It's really all in post where you're even going to get a sense of how the story will work, and they're very, 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 very difficult. It's harder to do than I think traditional sort of cinema, because I think you understand you have certain other ways to work on it. It still feels a little limiting, so it's a little harder, I think. It's like Mark Twain said, if I had more time, I'd write you a shorter letter. It's a little like that.
And just to follow up real quick, as far as cutting room floor, so UNVR tends to film in kind of chunks of 10 minutes or longer, where we really just let the scene unfold and let those nuanced little moments come to life. And so that ends up with lots of terabytes of data. But in other projects I've worked on, it's much tighter. Everyone's got a timer of 2 minutes or less. And so it just kind of depends on your agenda.
Great. Thanks, guys. Everyone, please thank Gabo and Barry.
Thank you.